Hey there, my name's Jordan, and I'm a financial coach and financial planner. And today I'm your host at the Reimagine Wealth podcast, where we share imperfect stories about embodying our values, weaving just system level safety nets, and working to build the world that we want to live in, one where we all get to have our needs met and thrive. Let these be shared learnings that allow you to more deeply explore, experiment, and shift, and that allow us to unlock our collective knowledge. This show is ad-free and available to everyone, and it wouldn't be possible without your love and support. So if you like what you're listening to, please like, review, subscribe, and share the show with those in your community. If you're able, please support my work to produce the show by becoming a paid member of my Substack, which starts at $6 a month. Link to that and more is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And now let's get into the show. In this episode, you are going to hear from Chuck Collins. Chuck Collins is the director of the Program on Inequality and the Common Good at the Institute for Policy Studies, where he co-edits inequality.org. He's an expert on U.S. inequality and the racial wealth divide, and the author of over 10 books and dozens of reports about inequality, climate disruption, philanthropy, the racial wealth divide, affordable housing, and billionaire wealth dynasties. Chuck is a founding member of Patriotic Millionaires, and in 1995 he co-founded United for a Fair Economy to raise the profile of the inequality issue and support popular education and organizing efforts to address inequality. He was the executive director at United for a Fair Economy from 1995 to 2001 and a program director until 2005. While Chuck is the author of many books, including Born on Third Base, A One Percenter Makes the Case for Tackling Inequality, Bringing Wealth Home, and Committing to the Common Good, in this episode, we will be discussing Chuck's book published in 2021 called The Wealth Hoarders: How Billionaires Spend Millions to Hide Trillions, which unmasks the industry of professional enablers that assist the ultra-wealthy to hide wealth and dodge taxes. This book was really instrumental for me in understanding how what Chuck calls in the book the wealth defense industry enables all of these systems of power that uphold injustice and inequity. Now let's get into it. Okay, we have a really special guest, someone whose work has mentored me and influenced me in the direction that I've chosen to go with my career and how I think about redistributing wealth and power. Chuck Collins is on the show today. Welcome, Chuck. I'm so happy you're here. Chuck Collins is, and you heard a little bit in the introduction leading up to this conversation, but Chuck Collins is the author of many books, one of which is called The Wealth Hoarders: How Billionaires Pay Millions to Hide Trillions. And we're going to be discussing this book today in much more detail. But Chuck, just to give listeners a little bit more of an idea of who you are in this world, your work, what shaped you. Generally, I ask folks to share their money story on this show. And so you can share as much or as little as you'd like to, but would love to give you the opportunity, Chuck, in your own words, to introduce yourself and share your own abbreviated money story with listeners.
Sure. Well, thank you for inviting me into this conversation, Jordan. And I grew up, I would call it sort of born on third base. I grew up in a wealthy family. My great-grandfather was the meat packer Oscar Mayer. So we have a joke in our family, which is bringing home the bacon meant something different in our house. And I learned in my late teens that I was going to inherit a pretty substantial amount of money when I came of age, when I turned 25, 26. And so that kind of, had an impact on me. But by the time that date came around, almost 40 years ago, I decided to give that inheritance away to a bunch of foundations working for social change. But I would say in terms of our topic discussion today, it gave me a very intimate front row seat into the trusted family advisors, the people who advise wealthy families about investing and wealth preservation and how to pass down as much as possible to your children and grandchildren. So I was sort of around that culture, and that sort of sparked me to get interested more in this topic that you and I are talking about.
Wonderful. Thank you for that intro. And for folks listening, if you want to learn more about Chuck, he has a book that actually goes into that in much more detail. And he's also doing amazing work, both with Patriotic Millionaires and the program on inequality and common good, where he co-edits inequality.org. So definitely check out that work. But today we will be focusing on the Wealth Hoarders book. And so, Chuck, in Wealth Hoarders, you introduce us to this concept of what you call the wealth defense industry, otherwise known as the WDI, which is, as you describe in the book, a militia of tax attorneys, wealth managers, accountants, trust lawyers, and other advisors that protect the interests of the ultra wealthy, or what we might think of as the 1%, against the wider community interest of the 99%. And this is enabled by these professionals, enabling the hiding of trillions of dollars from taxation. This is a really big systemic problem. And so I'm hoping that you can share first, what are the ramifications of this hidden wealth? And how are the times that we're currently living in, the rise of fascism, of authoritarianism, we're seeing the protests, the violence happening from ICE as just one of the ramifications. But yeah, can you help tie together the ramifications of this hidden wealth and how that's connected to rising authoritarianism that we're living in today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mentioned the front row seat to this wealth defense industry, the so-called trusted family advisors. It seems like sort of a benign thing, like, oh yeah, we're just helping families plan for the future and help plan for passing money on to children, something that most people hope to do. But when you are in an ultra wealthy family, and I would actually say that most of the people who have enough wealth to hire the wealth defense industry, that's sort of like the top 1/10 of 1%, people who have wealth sort of north of 40 million or more, all the way up to the billionaires. That's the group that is hiring and using that militia of tax attorneys and the like. And I would say there are a couple of harms that are important to understand. One is that when wealthy people can hide money, it empowers the kleptocrats, the grifters, the people who are trying to steal money or skim it for their own uses. And at the beginning of the book, I talk about people who are scamming working people out of their money to sell computers, or working in African nations to rob the people of their countries, of their national wealth, and move it out of the country through these same tools, these hidden wealth tools. So that's one of the big harms. The other is it essentially fuels inequality and shifts tax responsibilities off the wealthy onto everyone else. So working people end up paying more taxes, or seeing state and local and federal budgets cut for investments and services that they depend on. So it fuels and worsens inequality, and it also empowers this whole dynastic wealth, families, intergenerational wealth, hoarding and control. And all of those, I think, are part of what we're living through today. I mean, we're seeing rising authoritarianism, not all around the world and in the United States. And I think it's rooted in the couple more recent decades of inequality, where working people, 60% of the population has seen their real wages and security decline, and most of the gains in the growth of wealth and income have gone to the top 10%, and within that, the 1% and the top 1/10 of 1%. So all of that is fueling the resentment, anger, rage, and concerns that are tapped by someone like Donald Trump and other demagogues around the world who say, oh, I'm going to fix this problem. I'm going to make the world better for you, working folks, but in fact are just serving the interests of the oligarch wealth classes. So I think there's a lot of harms and ramifications in this hidden wealth system.
Yeah, and I think you do a really great job in the book of connecting the costs of that and then actually the symptoms of what that looks like. You call this the wealth that's hiding in our neighborhoods and how it's connected to things like the housing crisis, rapid gentrification and cost of living increases, as well as criminal activity like money laundering, Can you just share maybe one or two examples of, and you do a great job of painting this in the book. There's many examples, but maybe just one for listeners who haven't read the book of what does it actually look like to have this wealth hiding in our neighborhoods? What might we see or notice that maybe folks can't draw that conclusion to just yet?
Yeah, people hear about offshore tax havens and hidden trusts and all that, but the reality is the money is here. It's often maybe booked offshore, or there's a run through a bank account in Bermuda or the British Virgin Islands, but the money comes back. A lot of it comes back to the United States, in part because we are a stable, regulated market. And in the area of housing is one of those areas. So I would argue this hidden wealth system inflames and worsens the housing crisis. Wealthy, and you kind of have to get into the mind, your inner billionaire here. When you have that level of wealth, when you have tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, there's this challenge, which is where do you put it? You can't just put it in one place. You need to spread it around. And so the wealth advisors, the people that help invest the money of the super rich, love real estate. They like, because you can buy real estate in multiple markets. You can buy real estate in different forms. Well, this is really supercharging the existing housing crisis that's touching all of our communities. For instance, if you live in rental housing in a larger metropolitan area, we're seeing more and more wealthy investors buying up rental housing, owning it, converting it to short-term rentals, Airbnbs, buying up mobile home parks to squeeze more rents out of people who don't have a lot of mobility, and then building these huge residential towers, mostly in the coastal cities. You see these kind of pencils rising up. These are wealthy investors buying, I call them safe deposit boxes in the sky. They're not even buying houses and real estate to live in. It's a form of investment. It's a way to retain the value of their wealth by spreading it over lots of real estate markets and housing. So if you go to Manhattan in New York and stand in Central Park now, you look all around and you see these little residential towers rising. Some of them are very thin because the wealthy billionaires want a 360-degree condominium up on the 48th floor or whatever. So all of this basically worsens the housing crisis for everybody else. It pushes up the cost of land. It pushes up the cost of housing. The billionaires displace the millionaires displace everyone else. So it's just a really concrete way in which how these inequalities, these hidden wealth, actually harms people's desire just to have decent home or affordable housing or any home. And we could see that in a lot of areas in the economy, but housing is one where it really comes home, if you will.
Yeah, thank you so much for clearly painting that picture. And it reminds me, my parents co-own a condo with their friends in Park City in Utah. And I have seen that area. That wasn't really something that was possible for my family until we ascended classes. And it's just been within the last few years that they've co-owned this home. And I've seen the amounts of just units of homes that just sit vacant on a mountain in land that's also been privatized for the ski resort. So it's stolen land that has now been made privatized, and the cost to even go on that mountain have just skyrocketed. So it's just reminding me of that, and how I've even seen those really clear pictures of like, this is what it looks like. It's all these giant mansions sitting vacant when the people that actually are working there, providing the food services, providing the gear, helping to run the economy. A lot of folks who are immigrants cannot even afford to live in that area and have to bus there or kind of live in these manufactured communities that only operate during particular seasons. So yeah, anything else that you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that's a great example. Those, resort communities kind of have their own interesting dynamic. Where, Jackson Hole or wherever, where is it that the working people are going to live? And many of them have huge commutes over mountain passes to get to bust the tables of the ultra wealthy in restaurants and resort communities. So resort communities add a whole other twist to this dynamic. But yeah, the key here is that a lot of these units are vacant, and some of them are left vacant all year round. They're just investments. They're not homes. And that sucks up a lot of construction and natural resources and energy just to maintain a bunch of empty houses. There's a luxury tower in Boston where they literally had to expand the fracked gas pipeline to serve a building so that the wealthy could have their gas ignition stoves, but pretty much not live there. So it's a huge waste of our common treasure, if you will.
Yes, absolutely. I'm wondering, you explain this in such great detail in the book, but again, for folks who haven't had the chance to read it, I'd love to dig into some of the main strategies that you talk about in the book and share more practical examples of what this can look like. And you call this the wealth hiding toolbox, which I love. And it also makes me think about how we have the opportunity to remold tools to serve different purposes. But I'd love to examine each tool in this wealth hiding toolbox one by one, if that's okay with you. And for each one, if you can explain what they are and how they're used. And there's four different ones, and I thought we could start with shell companies, particularly in places like Delaware, if you don't mind starting there.
Sure. And one thing to say about the toolbox is that they often will deploy multiple tools to sort of mask or hide or move money. In the case of shell companies or Delaware as a state prides itself in you're able to create a limited liability company that does not have to disclose who its real owners are. So if you're a pornography company or ripping people off, or you're an international company that's looting money from the communities where you operate, Delaware is where you want to incorporate. And Delaware has bent its laws and regulations to benefit large global corporations and shell companies. But you could have a shell company in the Grand Cayman Islands or British Virgin Islands, also in Delaware, and you could transfer assets between those companies in a way that makes it almost impossible to trace. And that's part of the expertise of this wealth defense industry, is to make it hard for whether it's tax authorities or investigators who are trying to crack down on criminals, make it very hard for them to follow the money. So shell companies are one of the key tools. Companies where you don't have to disclose who the real owners, beneficiaries are.
Yes. And could you maybe you just mentioned it, but really for folks who maybe this is the first time hearing the word shell company, how is that possible that you can just transfer wealth so it doesn't look like it's owned by you? Can you explain a little bit more how that is structured and in greater detail what a shell company is?
Yeah, let's say I have a $10 million that I've gotten from a bribe, and maybe I've gotten it from the U.S. or I've gotten it from somewhere else, or I'm an official in a little authoritarian country somewhere in the world, and I've gotten this money. Where do I take it? Well, first I take it to a country that has a banking system and a place where you can incorporate a company without having to disclose who owns it. So I'll transfer money to my Delaware limited liability company, and then that company will transfer it to another account in a bank in the Cayman Islands. So I have the company and I have the anonymous bank account, both those things working together so that anybody following the trail will lose it. And the more layers of companies you want to put in. And I should say, how do we know this? Well, we know it primarily because of leaks. People in the wealth defense industry who believe they're causing the harms, they sort of see the harms, and they leak data. And there's a consortium of investigative journalists who are out there to receive that data and organize it and hire, they call them forensic accountants, people who can follow the money. You can imagine, like you see in some movies, with somebody with a giant wall with all the strings from different corporate entities. There's LLC 5B and LLC 5C, and trying to follow the money through this sort of process. So you're essentially saying, oh, this other entity owns it now. Now it's a Panamanian company that owns the wealth. and the money gets transferred around. It's a way you can launder money or hide transactions.
Thank you. And I think one of the commonalities that I really learned through reading this book was the trends of anonymity, not being able to trace who owns what or what assets belong to what, I want to say person, but since we treat companies like they're people, it's not even necessarily a person, but an entity, as well as secrecy. And I think that relates back to trusts as well. So can you share a little bit more about trusts? Why would I set up a trust and how are they used? And I think specifically, is it all trusts or is it like particular types of trusts that really enable this hiding of wealth?
Yeah, I mean, trusts are a form of ownership. Typically, a trust has three parts. There's the settlor, the person who creates the trust. There's the beneficiary, the person who benefits from the trust. And then there's the trustee themselves. And, there are legitimate uses of a trust. Let's say you have a disabled child or a parent, but you're concerned you're not going to be around to care for them. You might create a special needs trust. And I might say, hey, Jordan, would you be willing to be my trustee for my daughter because she'll outlive me and you'll be around and you can help be the trustee. You can act in my stead. And so you hear about legitimate uses of trust, but what's happened is that the wealth defense industry has figured out how to manipulate the trust form to essentially confuse ownership, put it into, I call it limbo. Who owns, the tax authorities come along and they say, well, who owns this, the money in this bank account? Oh, well, it's not me, Chuck. I set it up, but I don't own it. And it's not my daughter. She's a beneficiary. She doesn't own it. And it's not Jordan, my trustee. She doesn't own it. She's the trustee. Who owns it? And that's the whole purpose. And then they add other kind of layers and complexities and create all kinds of ways to use the trust form. So it's a little bit complicated, but it's basically a way to mask ownership and sort of a pre-common law, U.S. United Kingdom law system. I mean, it was really evolved in feudalism as a way to kind of have somebody help manage assets in a way that managing for the future.
Yes, I know Brooke Harrington has some amazing work around how trust came into being, as well as books like Offshore that go into greater detail too around some of these things in this wealth hiding toolbox. And I really appreciate what you're lifting up, which is it's subverting accountability. Who is accountable to pay taxes on this or to ensure that the wealth is used in a way that has a purpose, really, not just growing in perpetuity. And these are ways to subvert that accountability so that it's never clear who is actually accountable to that. And I think we touched on this a little bit with Delaware, but we think of so many of these as being like offshored, not in the US, but really taken into some other country or crossing a border of some sort. And really, that's not true necessarily any longer. And so Delaware is one example, but so is South Dakota and the dynastic trusts that are possible there. Could you share a little bit more about the dynastic trusts or dynasty trusts?
Yeah, as you point out, the U.S. now has become one of the biggest tax havens in the world. You have not only a lot of people in the U.S. hiding their money and not necessarily going offshore, but hiding it here in the U.S., but you have global billionaires and wealth grifters from around the world bringing their wealth to the U.S. because a number of states, and it's South Dakota among them, I think have become, I call them kind of trust haven states or tax haven states. They have changed their laws to attract at the request of the wealth defense industry, usually, they've changed their laws to attract investors and attract capital. South Dakota has a trust industry. They've built it up. They've lobbied the state to have the least standards and accountability. So if you want to create what we call a dynasty trust in South Dakota, that they're anonymous, they're not going to be taxed. And the reason they can be dynastic is they can live forever. And typically trusts and lots of legal ownership forms have a sort of limit to how long they can live. There's actually an arcane legal rule called the rule against perpetuities, basically saying you can't create things that live forever. You can't have the elders of today dominating 3 generations later, the next generation. The clock has to expire at some point. Well, they've waived those rules in South Dakota. You can create a trust that will last for hundreds of years, anonymously, outside the reach of tax authorities, outside the reach of accountability. And that is one of their selling points. But I should say there's kind of a race of probably a dozen states in the U.S. that are in this race: Nevada, Florida, Delaware, obviously, Texas. They're all kind of working to change their state laws to become wealth hiding friendly to their billionaires, both in their states and from around the world. So we, and because in the U.S. states have a lot of autonomy, that's what allows this to happen, our sort of system of federalism.
Yeah, thank you. And I know we're going to get into that more very soon in terms of like, how is this possible that we've created these really abstract, intricate, complex rules and regulations? Shouldn't we be able to correct this? But I'm wondering, the last tool that's really called out in the book is unregulated family offices. Could you share just a little bit about what is a family office and how is it connected to hiding and hoarding wealth for the ultra rich?
Yeah, and your listeners shouldn't feel bad if they've never heard of a family office. In fact, kind of that's the point. Family offices are sort of when you have a pretty high level of wealth, probably $250 million, $250 million. You no longer go to your investment advisor at Merrill Lynch or, Fidelity or whatever. You bring all those services in-house. You create a family office to manage your money, manage your charity activities, sometimes manage other things. So family office is simply kind of an organizing principle of you report directly to the family members. And so, yeah, people who become wealth defense industry professionals, or there's even a credential, the Society for Trust and Estate Planners. You can get a certificate and learn how to be a wealth manager and go work at a family office. So family offices, there's nothing necessarily inherently evil about them, except that they also use their power and clout to carve out a special status in terms of oversight and regulation. So back in after 2009, the economic meltdown, Congress was looking at how do we deal with the shadow financial system and all the derivatives and all the sort of games that the investor banker types were using to move money around. And the family offices formed their own association to lobby to make sure that they didn't fall under Dodd-Frank or any of the regulations that were put in place to protect and create transparency in the financial system. So yeah, family offices, I call them unregulated in the sense that they're now Wild West money. And a lot of it, really big wealthy investors who had private equity funds or hedge funds converted them to family offices so they could escape any oversight or regulation. So a lot of these activities we're describing are done at a family office. The family office becomes the place where people come together and figure out how to create these tax dodges and tax avoidance schemes. Not all of them, but enough that it becomes one of the purposes. Just to say in summary, the wealth defense industry sort of has 3 sacred obligations in their mind. One is to help their clients accumulate as much money as possible. The second is to minimize tax, avoid tax. And the third is maximize dynastic succession. Make sure as much money as possible goes down the generational line. And that is what their North Star is, and that's what family offices are focused on. Make the pile bigger, minimize tax, and make sure that the great-great-grandchildren have wealth when they come along. That's their mission.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I know in the beginning of the book, you talk about this concept of the money river. And all of these tools that we just talked about are creating large dams in that river, that money river, so that the money does not flow back into communities like it should. And one of the main arguments that you also make is that the industry itself cannot be responsible for policing itself, which to me, I'm like, well, of course. Like if I had all the power, I can't be accountable to that without checks and balances. So we really need lawmakers to hold the wealth defense industry accountable for their accomplice roles that they're playing. And you talk about three main ways that we can do this: through lawmaking, through policy, and that's corporate transparency, beneficial ownership, and country by country reporting. Can you just share a little bit more about how would these reforms really mitigate this hiding of trillions of dollars and supporting that money river flowing wealth back into communities?
Yeah, I think people say, oh, we can't, there's no way we can fix the system. But actually, there are a whole bunch of efforts to reform and fix this money hiding system. Corporate transparency is clear. It's just like, who are the owners? There's provisions in a bunch of countries now that require disclosure of, I use the phrase beneficial ownership. That's like, who are the real owners? Who are the real beneficiaries of these institutions? So transparency and disclosure of beneficial ownership get at the same thing, which is, who are the real parties behind this? And secrecy is central to the system. It doesn't operate without a lot of secrecy. And by simply saying, look, you are operating in a regulatory market, we need to know who owns this property, who owns this condominium, what are the transactions between companies. Most ordinary people, you take money and you put it in the bank. That, believe it or not, there's a lot of people know who owns your bank account. They know who you are. You're not going to have a very easy time hiding income when it comes time to pay your taxes, because there is transparency. But for the ultra wealthy, this system depends on huge levels of secrecy. So a number of states and countries are, and even in the United States, we have a push for corporate transparency because they found a lot of these corporations are operating illegally or doing money laundering or engaged in illegal acts. And even law enforcement can't track them down. They get to that Delaware limited liability company and boom, the search is over. So there's pressure, legislative pressure. There was a legislation passed called the Corporate Transparency Act that was going to require corporations to disclose who their real beneficial owners are. That kind of got stalled or put on hold by the Trump administration, unfortunately, but it's operative in a number of other countries. So that's a really important fix, if you will.
Yeah, and it's funny to me. It's not funny in the sense of like how this all works, but these are simple solutions. Like it's updating reporting structures. It's adding lines to declare who the owner is, to have that accountability, and it's very clear as to, it's not hard to implement. So it brings up this question of like, well, why is it structured in this way? And I really view this book as a way of calling out the wealth defense industry, because in a way, it's these teams of professionals that enable this to be possible, even though the justification for themselves is that they're not doing anything illegal. Like, this is all technically legal, and yet it's creating significant harms, much more than the majority of the things that people are in prison for. So they claim that they're just obeying the rules. And you go on to point out that these very rules that they claim to just be following are actually very much in their control. They're actually written and designed by the wealth defense industry. They're engineering them. So can you share a little bit more about how does this happen? One example is bending the intent of trust law. So maybe starting there, how is it possible that both the people following the rules are also the same people writing the rules?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are multiple, if you talk to people in the wealth defense industry, they'll sort of have 2-3 justifications for what they do. They'll say, well, we're just helping families. We're just helping families, protect their wealth. Well, actually, they're helping the wealthiest families on the planet at the expense of all other families, but that's, And we're just helping them obey the law. We're just involved in compliance. We don't write the laws. We are just helping people obey them. And that's a very cynical answer, because the reality is people in the wealth defense industry are writing the laws. They're writing the rules, and they're creating new ownership forms and helping morph, like the trust ownership form in the state of New Hampshire. They've created something called the Civil Law Foundation. These are all legal instruments created just for the purpose of this kind of wealth hiding and wealth obfuscation. And they're often incredibly complex. And I would just say complexity is the bread and butter of this industry. They're trying to make lots and lots of layers, so even law enforcement or others cannot understand what's going on. So they are actively involved in writing the rules, lobbying for them. The reason that South Dakota has the laws that it has is because the trust industry in South Dakota has a committee, and every year they say, oh, we now, legislature, we need you to make these 2 legal changes so we can compete against Nevada. So they're constantly influencing and in fact, drafting the legislation to advance the wealth hiding agenda. So yeah, they're not just obeying the law, they are writing the laws. And I think that's a really important thing to understand here. And then the other thing is that there's really no sort of countervailing power. Who else is keeping an eye on this? Who else is spending the time sorting through this complexity to understand what's really going on, or who even's being harmed? And that's the other problem, is most people have no clue as to how the system works and how it's affecting them on a day-to-day basis, which I guess is why I wrote the book, is to say, this affects all of us. And it's not that hard, as you said, Jordan, it's not that hard to fix this. You just need the political will to understand the harms that it's causing. Then I think you get a lot of people on your side wanting to fix it.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's a coincidence that you chose the terms wealth defense industry, which is connection to militarism. And it reminds me of Gene Sharp's kind of upside down pyramid, where it's kind of the system, or in this case, wealth hoarding or wealth hiding, and these pillars that hold up the system. Or if we think about the state or militarism, like what are those pillars? It's the National Guard, it's ICE, it's the police, it's the prison industrial complex. We could go on and on. But I see a very strong comparison as the pillars in the wealth hoarding industry. It's the lawyers, the advisors, the consultants, the wealth managers. So anything that you want to add there in terms of how you see the connection between the wealth defense industry and militarism as the pillars really holding up the system?
No, I think that's right. I think it's always good to look at who's enabling a system. Who are the interests and players that sort of enable it? And wealth defense industry is a nice way of saying kind of protection racket, the paid protectors who are monitoring and defending your assets from law enforcement and tax authorities and the public knowledge, So, to understand a system, you need to understand the pillars and enablers that hold that system in place. Some people will say, oh, it's the billionaires. Well, actually, yeah, the billionaires, but they're hiring other people. They're hiring a whole class of people who see their role, who've developed an identity all of their own as a class. They're not as wealthy as the billionaires or the people that hire them, although some of them probably, but they highly identify with them and their interests and work to advance them.
Yes. And it makes me think about, in your writing, the cracks in the wealth defense system, that there's a new generation of wealth managers that are not engaged in this work. And that makes me think of myself as a dissenter in this space and trying to just I got my hammer and I'm hitting that pillar to be like, let this fall. So can you share more about what's happening in that space? Where are the cracks that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think there are individuals who, wealth holders, who are saying, hey, I hired you, but I don't really want you to aggressively avoid taxes. I don't mind, there are wealthy people who believe they have a responsibility to pay their fair share of taxes, and they don't want to hire somebody who's going to undermine that. There, as I mentioned, within the wealth defense industry, there are people who want to do the right thing and have shared data, leaked data, disclosed it, told organized other wealth defense industry folks. Now, Brooke Harrington, you mentioned earlier, who wrote this terrific book, Offshore, she went through this training program as a sociologist to learn how to become a wealth manager. And she said there's about 25% of those people are true believers. They just think the rich are the most oppressed people in the world, and they want to help them liberate themselves from governments and the rest of us, accountability. And then there's a bunch of people who are just like, this is a job. I'm just doing my job. But there's about 25% of the people who know what they're doing actually is harmful, and they are trying to find a different way or a different path out of it. And some of them are forming advisory firms that are focused on healthy investing and philanthropy and not aggressive tax avoidance. So both the wealthy individuals and the advisors are creating a new sector. There's a progressive advisors network. There's people like the Good Ancestor movement, Stephanie Broby, who's a wealth advisor in England, who says, our job is to help wealthy people engage their money in a way that heals the harms caused by the initial wealth extraction, to minimize and give away wealth in a way that's good for society. So the good news is it's not all like a monolithic wall. There are a whole lot of people rethinking this and creating alternatives.
Absolutely. It makes me think about Chosen Family Office and the work that I do at Oberon Capital Advisors and through Reimagine Wealth, which is instead of centering, maximizing as much wealth for this individual few, but thinking about it through the lens of interdependence and relationship and repair. So how does redistribution further that? So thank you for lifting that up. And I'm wondering, I think there's a need, right, for more dissenters in this space. Like, I am constantly like, if there's any radical lawyers out there that want to get together and scheme and organize around rewriting the fiduciary duty to factor in these externalities, that's a big area where I see even more progressive politicized wealth managers bump up against. How can I justify this as prudent, since that's how I'm evaluated and what the Security and Exchange Commission will evaluate my choices on if I get sued. So that makes me think about that. And I'm also wondering, we're in this time with the big, beautiful budget bill right now that's in the Senate. And this makes me think a lot about the costs that you laid out, about the consequences of this hidden wealth and how this bill is going to really further that. And I've also noticed that some people aren't even aware of this bill. So I'm putting you on the spot. I'm not sure how well versed you are in it, actually. But could you just share some context about it and how you see this as being connected to wealth hoarding and the wealth defense industry?
Sure. Well, I think, those of us, we've been living through the first 6-7 months of the Trump administration. Almost all the actions that we're hearing about are executive actions. They're actions taken by the administration, the executive branch. Congress has not done much, but there's sort of 2 or 3 real driving agendas there. One is there are a lot of provisions in the 2017 Trump tax cut that are expiring. And so they're super motivated to try to get back in there and make permanent or extend the tax breaks, mostly that were skewed to the wealthy. I don't call it the big, beautiful bill. I call it the big billionaire bill, or the ugly bill, or whatever. It is the one, they're basically saying, look, Congress isn't going to do much. They're not clearly doing much on the oversight side. They're giving up their power as Congress to the executive branch. But budgets are still the purview of Congress. And so they have to at least pass one budget to keep the government open, whatever parts of the government that are left. So that's what the big billionaire bill is. And it is worth your listeners taking some time to understand what's in this bill. There's still a lot of provisions most of us are still puzzling over. There are things that get at the president's further immunity from any kind of prosecution. There's huge budget cuts. the continuation of these massive tax cuts for the ultra wealthy and some new tax cuts. There's one provision I've been tracking, which is, I call it the luxury jet loophole. Congress wants to make it possible for people who have private jets to be able to deduct the cost of their purchase in 1 year. So basically, it's a huge subsidy to the private jet manufacturers and flyers. So, and it's rolling. It passed the House. The Senate is now debating it. It's a disaster from a policy point of view. It's going to worsen inequality. It's going to cut health care for millions of people. It's a reckless bill. And I think they know that. And the reason why they want to move so quickly and the president wants to see it before the 4th of July is because once people realize and wake up to what's in it, they're going to want to resist it and stop it. So they know they have to move as fast as possible to move this along. And maybe very possible by the time as soon as when you want to release this, that it may have passed. I mean, the best case scenario is we all speak up. We let our senators know, particularly friends and senators who live in swing districts where there might be a Republican senator who might oppose it. And there's only a handful, but they could slow it down so it's very possible that a very different bill could come out of the Senate, and then they would have to sort of reconcile it. The truth is, the longer this gets dragged out, the slower the process, the better from the point of view of people waking up to knowing what's really in it. What's fascinating was to see Elon Musk, the president's former best buddy, coming out and saying this is an abomination and it's going to add to the deficit and it's full of bad provisions. So even within the conservative movement now, there's some cracks in terms of the support for the bill. But yeah, it's an important moment to weigh in and pay attention. And particularly if you live in a swing state where your senator might be on the fence, to let them know.
Yeah. And it's also making me think about the need we're seeing all of this mass mobilized resistance right now in places like LA and the South, and really just in New York. The National Guard was deployed in Austin, which is where I live. And so just also thinking about what's needed in this moment. And do I really believe that my senators in Texas are going to respect what most of us are going to be calling them about? I don't. And yet, even if I don't win this one, there's still the need to try. Because if we don't even try, then we're giving up the power that we already have and the need to think ahead. So how are we thinking these reductions in Medicaid and healthcare services and SNAP benefits? How are we thinking about food pantries? How are we thinking about getting to know our neighbors and building relationships and free clinics? And we have a lot to learn from past movements and mutual aid efforts. So making me think a lot about that as well in terms of collective action. And this is a philosophical question, but the last question I have for you, Chuck, and I feel like I could talk to you all day because you have so much wisdom to share, and I really appreciate it. But I'm curious, especially as we're seeing, like you just mentioned, this bill is actually not going to affect the deficit. It's actually going to add to it. And we're seeing our tax dollars go towards increased policing, towards ICE, towards prisons and the border and what's happening in Gaza, and just war and militarism. So how do you orient to taxation and tax justice when at the same time we see our tax dollars being funneled to fund things that only increase and perpetuate harm? And I'm wondering within that question, is there ever a situation where you would advocate to not tax the wealthy, or just how you think about that and tax resistance, those types of things?
Yeah, it's a really important question because, if you're writing your check to pay your taxes, as most people do, you're kind of sitting there thinking, okay, where is it going to go? I mean, this may seem a little theoretical, but I think it's important to say there's sort of two struggles. One is over the shape of the tax system and who pays. And right now, the tax system at the federal level is moving more and more toward more regressive, meaning that tax responsibilities are shifting more onto wage earners off of wealth holders. off of the rich onto everyone else. So regardless of whether you agree with the policies of the government or not, I think it's fair to say we should have a fair tax system where, whatever it is we the people decide, the revenue is fairly raised. So there's the how do we raise the revenue, and then how is it used? And that is another fight. And that is the fight over government, public policy. And it's very difficult right now to appreciate just how captured our political system is by the wealthy interests, by the prison industries, by the fossil fuel industry. Our democracy is in such a pitiful state that these big industries pretty much get their way. They're so powerful. But that is a different struggle than the struggle of what kind of tax system we should have. So, I guess I would argue the role for particularly wealthy people should not be to opt out of the federal tax system. It should be saying we should be paying our fair share. We should be part of a fair tax system. Otherwise, you're going to have a system where and by the way, the wealthy can opt out. That's the problem here, is that under the current system, wealthy people opt out of their responsibilities and obligations because of these porous rules and weakened enforcement. And then I think we need to have powerful movements over how the money is used. How do we spend the money, and what our budget should be. And where I work at the Institute for Policy Studies, we have a project called National Priorities Project that's very focused on the military budget and on militarism and the budget priorities in general. I mean, we would have a lot more money for human services and for things that help people if we dialed down our currently $900 billion defense budget, so military budget. So, we need to be part of those fights. How do we use the money? And then the separate political struggle over who pays and how do we make sure the wealthy pay their fair share.
Thank you for touching on that. And it's such an intricate, nuanced topic, especially right now. And yeah, right now our taxes, regardless of how they're actually being used, it is the largest wealth redistribution mechanism that we have, and we shouldn't all have our own individual power over where that goes. What would it look like to design a tax system that actually is democratic? Feels like the larger question. So thank you. And I know we covered so much. I want to make space if you have any final thoughts or invitations or collective action that you would like folks to engage in, learn more about. But before we wrap up, anything else that you want to add?
You sort of presaged this, but, I think there's how do we build resilience and mutual aid in our own communities? How do we strengthen our neighborly relations and relationships with our neighbors so that we can be involved in? That's the foundation of certainly local government and state government. So I live in a little rural town in Vermont, and one of the things we started doing in January is we started a weekly coffee clatch, and we started a homesteader mutual aid group that basically every Sunday morning we go to somebody else's house and help them out, and then we help some elders that need help. So we have this little roving group that helps one another and helps our neighbors. And then I have a group of men who get together every Monday morning. We have our coffee discussion about what is it we're going to do and how are we doing and how do we engage in the next response and resistance. A lot of us marched over the weekend. We have a little town of 12,000 people. We had 3,000 people marching for No King's Day, June 14th. All of that stuff is really, really important, and rooting it in local place and relationship is key. And then I think looking for the cracks in the current political moment. I think you mentioned living in Texas. Well, there are a whole bunch of interests that don't support the practices of the current administration. There are a lot of wealthy people who believe they should pay their fair share of taxes. We need to amplify all those messages and resistances in this moment. And I've been very saddened to see all the policies to slow the march toward climate disruption and climate change being dismantled. I grew up and was recently visiting Michigan, where There's a coal plant that was supposed to close on June 1st, and it's being kept open simply because the coal industry lobbied the president to basically declare an energy emergency and consider coal plants as critical infrastructure, which is ridiculous, right? You're basically saying the ratepayers are going to have to pay more than they would for clean energy to keep the coal industry going. So finding those kind of common sense pressure points and really picking a couple of really good campaigns for each of us to be involved with is I think important. And one sort of fun thing is I encourage people to check out Trillionaires for Trump and join the satirical resistance. So there's back in 2001, 2004, when George W. Bush was running for president, we created this kind of narrative shift project called Billionaires for Bush. And hundreds of local chapters formed and people got engaged. And it was a way to kind of shift the narrative and make fun and laugh at the same time. Well, so that's what Trillionaires for Trump is doing. So check out Trillionaires for Trump as a kind of part of the satirical resistance, which is actually a form of power. So those are a few sort of closing thoughts, I guess.
I love that. If we can't have joy and humor centered in this, then we can't just be like a militant, constantly angry all of the time. We have to find our joy, and that brings us together too, for the long haul. Chuck, thank you so much. Thank you for being such a mentor to so many people who are dissenting in their own class backgrounds, and I just appreciate it so much. So thank you.
Thanks for inviting me into conversation.
Thank you so much for listening to the Reimagine Wealth podcast. You can find resources and links from today's episode in the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, review, subscribe, and share this with those in your community. If you'd like to support the show, you can become a paid member of my Substack, which allows me to sustain this work and have more episodes to share in the future. Again, links to all of that and more are in the show notes. And until next time, I'm sending you resilience and warmth, and thank you so much for tuning in.